Do not change the station. What you're hearing is coming from the Big Sci-Fi Podcast and the Trek Geeks Podcast Network. Stay tuned for the next exciting episode of... Wait a minute. Receiving a new transmission. What is that? What am I seeing? It's big. It's really big. Oh my God, it's so... Welcome to Season 6 of the Big Sci-Fi Podcast, the biggest sci-fi podcast in the galaxy. Join our crew, Adina, Brian, Cris, and Steve, as we travel the Milky Way looking for the best that science fiction has to offer. Make sure you're strapped in tight, because we're going to have a lot of fun talking all things sci-fi. Stay tuned to this channel for the next audio transmission.
Welcome back, listeners of the Big Sci-Fi Podcast. While we usually delve very deep into science fiction, today we're exploring a unique blend of science and what I like to call sci-fi adjacent entertainment with a very special guest from one of our favorite shows, The Big Bang Theory and its spinoff, Young Sheldon. So this is all my co-host Chris's fault. A few weeks ago, he was like, we should talk to the guy who does science for Big Bang Theory. So I reached out to Professor David Saltzberg, and here we are. We did have to wait until after the finale of Young Sheldon aired, and we are going to be spoiling that in the show today. So if you don't want spoilers and you haven't watched it yet, just pause. We'll wait while you go binge the rest of Young Sheldon, binge the rest of that final season. My little pro tip, have a large box of tissues handy. There are some massive tearjerker moments in those last episodes or two.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today's episode here, though, is going to be a real treat and hopefully no crying. Dr. David Saltzberg, he's a renowned physicist out at UCLA, where he teaches and conducts research in particle physics. He's going to deep dive into how he's helped make some of these complex concepts, from the Doppler effect to subatomic particles to relativity and supersymmetry, how he's made them accessible and fun. And we'll also talk about his experiences behind the scenes of these beloved shows. David, welcome to the Big Sci-Fi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you. And I think we should just start, tell us how you originally just got attracted to having a career in science and in physics.
Well, as far as I can remember, I always was oriented this way and liked it. Probably a big aspect of it was that my father was an engineer. He worked for Bell Labs back during its heyday. And we did lots of things, a little electricity with the model train sets, other things like that. I used to get this monthly things of science would come in the mail. Got a little older, and maybe junior high level, a friend and I used to blow things up with some chemicals and stuff that we found. Definitely not something that would pass any of the science safety trainings that we get, but we managed to make it back. My mother said if I didn't have all my fingers, I wasn't allowed to come home. And then in terms of why physics, I always just liked it and put one foot in front of the other. When we hit it in high school, which was a typical thing where we used to do biology first, then chemistry, then physics, which I think is very common. Physics was always this revelation of how everything under those was working. There is a move afoot to have physics first, so people can know, for example, what energy is, which is useful when talking about how living things work. But then that's rare. And so I just liked it. And I also liked the puzzle solving aspect of physics. Mm-hmm. And I always just wanted to learn. And I read a lot of nonfiction about science that was intended for the public or teenagers. Things like Isaac Asimov. In addition to all of his science fiction, he wrote science fact about
everything,
other things, and
about everything.
About things that I wanted to understand, about particles and what they're made of, and I didn't. And so, but I just enjoyed it each step along the way, and so just kept going. It wasn't a grand plan.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And so our listeners might not know, we talk all the time that I work in the aerospace industry, but I don't think I talk about all the time that my undergraduate was also in physics. A lot of people just assume that because I work in engineering, my degree's in engineering, but no, I started out in physics too, although probably for slightly different reasons. But one thing you just said, which I like to emphasize when anyone is ever thinking about these kinds of careers, is you also said you liked it. And that was my experience as well. I loved physics, and in order to get through a major like that, I think you have to love it. If you hate it, you're not going to make it through. No matter how smart you are or anything else, you really do need to love it.
Although it also can be that you might take one course in college or university and not like it, and that could just be the way that course was set up. And the second course you take, you might love it.
Yep, and that's true. I know people who didn't clash with a particular professor, which meant they had a bad experience, which set them on a different path, which is a shame, because which just goes to show how important the professors that we have are. So, did you grow up as a science fiction fan as well?
That's interesting, because I thought you might ask me that based on your podcast, and I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I grew up reading a lot of the science fiction, the Martian Chronicles. I think I tried to get through Dune as a teenager and didn't finish. Everybody mad at me. I watched, and we can talk about this, the various things that were on television, from Battlestar Galactica, things like that. But I wouldn't call myself a sci-fi aficionado. I've kind of let that drop, and certainly don't ask me questions about the things that I had read to see if I remember them. And not that not that I don't enjoy it, and it's just somehow I haven't. I should go back and pick that up.
Well, it sounds like you're a very busy fellow in life as well. So that is something that I love about science fiction, though, is that it does attract people from all different walks of life. And I think also that was something that we loved about The Big Bang Theory and Young Sheldon, is that those are just shows that people from various different walks of life can tune into week in and week out, or stream now and binge watch them, whatever, and could relate to it and find stuff to hold on to that entertained them, that made them laugh, that made them cry, that taught them stuff about life and science too, and all that stuff. So it's a great crossover thing there.
We would be surprised by how many people come up to us and say, "Oh, they're such they grew up as such misfits. They really identify with the characters." And sometimes it'd be like, "You don't seem like too much of a misfit, but okay."
Do you associate yourself with any of the four characters from the show that you saw that and you went, that's okay, that's relatable. That's relatable.
It's so funny, we get asked this a lot, and I don't let them pick out any one of the characters, because then my friends or the actors might wonder, well, why didn't you pick me? But I have, for example, found myself explaining why I wanted to sit in a particular part of a room in a particular chair.
Right. Okay.
I think Raj gets not picked often enough, so I could pick Raj because I think he's got a great presence and challenges in life. They're all great.
My youngest daughter, when she was in school, I would say, "Let's watch the show." She goes, "No, I can't." And I said, "Why don't you?" She goes, "Because I live with those people."
Right.
See, that was why I love the show.
We noticed a lot of people would say, "I know someone just like Sheldon," and a lot of people told us that, and no one ever said, "I'm just like Sheldon." So you can do the math on
really?
that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's interesting.
True.
But the concept of you have these this group of friends, and what they have this mixture of talking about science and then playing games and science fiction. That was the group of people I hung out with at college. So I don't know if one of us was one or like the other, but just the fact that was kind of their, I'll say, culture, to me, that was what made this show. It's like, oh my God, I've lived this.
Right. And that, I think, did bring a lot of people in the beginning. And then more and more people found it after that.
Yeah, I didn't start watching the show until the third season. I had really not much knowledge. And then when I started watching, I'm going, oh, this is really funny stuff. And it's interesting and relatable because, everyone's has a bit of a nerd in them, no matter how macho they want to be. They get excited about watching an old science fiction film or seeing something and relating back to it or whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of them in all of us, I would say.
And people that haven't seen too much of the show might go, "Oh, this is nerd humor" or something like that. But there's a lot more to it. First of all, the writers were always careful to say that these were exceptional people. They weren't writing them specifically as this concept of what you would call a nerd. And I think the humor came out of these are people that are very talented and bright in one aspect of life and not at all in another aspect of life. And that was the tension that brought it together. And I was going to say so they're just really exceptional people.
So how did you originally get involved in the show?
So it was really funny because I've lived in Los Angeles since 1997. I came here for my job at UCLA. I had no connection to Southern California, which is in Los Angeles, which is the heart of what they call the industry in quotes. And sometimes I would venture out of my little bubble of physicists and if I was invited to a neighbor's party or something, and something about Los Angeles, if you go to just a random gathering of people, lots of them are involved with the industry. So I was just kind of this weirdo that I was just this physics professor. And I figured, okay, that's the way it's going to be. I'm obviously never going to have any reason to cross with this entertainment industry. And then through really a chance of a friend of a friend of a friend of one of the co-creators put me in touch with them. They were looking for someone to ask a few physics questions to. And that turned into just being a constant presence as the physics consultant. It's a little bit lost history. I should say, they started with a friend of mine who put me in touch, and he had since moved far away and couldn't continue being a physical presence. And so my friend Peter Gorham in Hawaii. So I stepped in at that point during the first pilot, but that's how I got connected. It was just word of mouth. It wasn't something I sought out.
That's amazing.
Oh, that's interesting.
I am dying to ask about the whiteboards.
Right.
How are the different equations? I think they're all equations. Like, how is that decided on for each episode?
So it's interesting. Well, first we should distinguish between sets and props.
Oh, okay, right.
I didn't know before I was in television. The sets and set dressing are things that are on the wall, like you're talking about.
Okay.
But props or properties are things that the actors touch.
Right, yes.
So there are those roughly 3 whiteboards, and some seasons there was a chalkboard that would be on the wall, and really no interaction with the cast other than they might walk by it. And that was set dressing. And I would write those up and send those in. I started by Xeroxing handwritten stuff, and then later on an iPad. And there was one of the members of the set dressing team had great handwriting just like mine, and made it because it has to look like math, right? The way it would be drawn. And there's many ways to do it, but he did a beautiful job of that. What I would do is, if there is something that would have been in the news that they might be talking about, that would, in the physics news, it would be up there. For example, when the great John Wheeler died, and in fact, I think Adina may know him.
I never met him, but famous physicist.
And so they had his famous greatest hits, let's say, on the whiteboards, because it's conceivable they would have been talking about, because we're only visiting them one day a week, but they had lives that were going on. We just weren't there. And so a lot of the time my concept was, what would they have been talking about? Sometimes they might have been talking about something in the Cheesecake Factory before we see them in their living room. And then it's conceivable that they would have come in and written something on the boards about it. One thing I tried to do, which I gave up on, was if they were talking about something in one episode, I'd be like, okay, well, maybe they continued to talk about it, and I'd put it on the next episode. But sometimes they aired out of order. So not that anyone noticed that.
Mm-hmm.
Other times it was just something I found interesting that was in the, that I put up there. And there were other times that it was just some, scribbles. I never made it anything distracting. It was never like weird puns using Greek letters that the people in the audience who knew science would get. I've seen that in movies and so forth. I find it jarring if you do. And so I tried to make it just really what would be on there. And then just to finish that, then props would be something where if you saw one of the characters like Sheldon writing an equation, if you look carefully, often he's just writing the last X in the equation or a dot to something that the actor doesn't have a lot to memorize. But the way they cut it, it makes it look like he just wrote all of that. And often that would be connected to whatever the dialogue was that they had at the moment. So that was kind of easy. But with 279 episodes and 3 chalkboards, I did sometimes run out of ideas. But there were also diagrams. If there was a plot that was in the news that somebody might, the mass of a new particle, I tried I tried not just to have only equations. I tried to have some diagrams. I tried to have color.
Yeah, the color was really good. I just find when I watch the show, like obviously I'm paying attention to everything going on, but it's just I'm drawn to the whiteboard and how colorful it is and just how neat. And I'm always like, I had this fantasy of being able to do math just for the purpose of putting it on a whiteboard because I just love how visually interesting it looks. So like that was like perfect.
Anyway, there's another race. Some of them I'm kind of proud of, that they did connect to some interesting things that were going on. Other ones were kind of just some doodling.
But it was accurate though.
Yeah, but accurate doodle, yeah. But that's what a whiteboard is. A whiteboard is often, you might use it at one moment to show someone something, in which case it'll be kind of organized. Another time you might use a whiteboard basically like scratch paper to yourself. And so it'll look different at different times.
Yeah. So in later seasons, there definitely seemed to be some continuity between episodes, especially with like Sheldon's career, as he was kind of trying to figure out what to do after string theory. And then in the final season, when they got into like that super asymmetry. So were you involved, needing, I guess, some of that continuity? Did you get, I guess, involved in the scripts even earlier to make that happen? How did that?
Right. So in general, what was my involvement with this? First of all, the writers know so much about everything. If you're going to be a TV writer, I think there's just you know enough about everything that you can create a world, and actors are really good at playing make believe. So in the end, if they didn't have me, they would be okay because that's their skill set is to be able to create a world. That said, what I did was I started coming to Big Bang Theory was taped in front of a live audience. It was like, that's why you see sort of 3 walls and not 4. It's why it feels somewhat theatrical, I think, if you watch it. So I used to come to the episodes originally they might need me. There might be some science question. But the truth is almost never would they touch the science part of the script or anything at that point. They would rewrite jokes if the audience didn't laugh. I say comedy appeared to me to be an empirical exercise. You can argue that theoretically that something's funny, but if people don't laugh, you need to figure out why, and they would rewrite that. But they didn't tend to, almost never did they rewrite the science. So I used to come to every episode for that reason, but it was clearly not the reason I needed to be there. But then at the same time, I realized a good reason for me to actually be there was I would chat with the writers about some future episode or what might happen. And it's the kind of thing where like, yeah, they could call you on the phone or they could email you, but you know how people are, probably won't happen. And just by being there and sharing a little dinner in between scenes, it was very low barrier to have that kind of discussion. So in general, I was there. To answer your question about the continuity, until the last season, there wasn't huge story arcs, right? There was some slow development of the characters, but it wasn't one episode building on the previous episode very much. And that's 2 different styles. What I've heard of talking to TV writers, there's different styles. One is to write to a conclusion, and the other is to, which I think was more of Big Bang, they put their characters in a situation and they knew their characters and they asked themselves, how would this character react? And it would go wherever it went. So most of it was, I think, the latter, with some very slow development. Girlfriends become fiancés, become spouses very slowly. But we did have we did actually have this idea that the ending would be Sheldon and Amy winning a Nobel Prize. I hope that's not a spoiler at this point. And we needed to have those. And then it was fun because we would talk about things and well, can't they get a Nobel Prize? And I'm like, well, you can't really get a Nobel Prize for just something theoretical. It has to be proven. And so that started this idea of, oh, well, maybe there's this lab, we had Fermilab in that case, observe it. And then I mentioned, and then they were like, well, all four get the Nobel Prize. And I'm like, well, actually, only three people can win it. So that, of course, the writers realize there's a point of tension, a point of conflict. So they pick up on that. I could never really quite predict what the writers would pick up on and find interesting or not. So I would kind of just talk. And when I did think like, oh, this is really great, I got to tell them this, and they would go, meh. And they would really pick up on something that I was just almost even didn't even say, and then they would run with it.
What was it like working with Chuck Lorre and Steve Malero? I mean, did you interact with them directly, or was it only with the writers and the showrunners?
Chuck Lorre and Steve Malero are part of the writing team. They're and so the wonderful gentlemen, absolutely wonderful. And others too. There's also Steve Holland had the realm for a while. Bill Prady originally had, and I could go on. I don't want to list all the names. Really dedicated to their craft, really struggling with what's the reality here, what's the truth here, and incredible talent to just make it funny. I would read the draft scripts all alone in my bedroom and just laugh out loud, just reading it. And I would be there sometimes during rehearsals, and it was wonderful how these people you mentioned would find a way to make the joke a little funnier, just in the way that people were moving around the stage, or by adding one line or taking away one line, and just fine tuning the emotional part of the scene. It's a little hard for me to give examples, but in my own world, in science, I can see someone one of my students preparing a scientific talk, and I can give feedback on how to make it better. It's immediately obvious to me, let's say, how to make it better. And when you take people like Chuck and the Steves and Bill and the others, they have decades of experience with this. And so it's remarkable how they can improve it and explain what needs to happen. And big supporters of science. They love the fact that people will come by and say, I got involved in science because of this. You may know that the writers, as well as the cast and the crew, put together a scholarship for UCLA STEM majors, science, technology, engineering.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
So all these people, let's say, so you just talked about the writers, just wonderful people, wonderful human beings, and wonderful at their craft. And then in general, there are like something I hadn't realized in when I watch television, I see two people talking. How complicated can that be? But then you realize there's like 20 departments that make that happen. Lighting, sound, I'm going to forget wardrobe. We talk about props and sets, cameras, and so on, right? And what was amazing about this on Big Bang was that these people you talk to all had decades of experience. And they would ask me questions like, is this the right color goggles? If you use brass bolts or aluminum bolts here? Even the actors sometimes would ask me, what should I be doing at this table? And people really, really wanted to do a good job, and they really wanted to and they had the experience to do it as well. And I think about that sometimes, like sometimes you watch something, maybe it's an amateur production, and you're like, this doesn't seem right? But you're not quite sure what it is. Like, what is it about something when you see that it feels amateurish versus something that really works wonderfully? And I think the answer I thought of, and it's just me, but the answer I thought of was, well, everything matters. And so it's just these 20 departments working, every one of them working together, doing A+ work, is what makes it work.
When they proposed coming up with Young Sheldon as a follow-up show to Big Bang, and they wanted to come up with this junior version of Sheldon, in your ramblings through science and so on, there are true young Sheldons out there. There are truly young geniuses out there. Have you encountered them? Are they, so fixated on science, or are they, they're still kids? Do you have ever come in contact with those young prodigies?
There are a few around. Occasionally I come across someone who's a lot younger than the other students here. And it sometimes can be a challenge if they're under 18 and a lot of the activities are over 18. You have to be there's some challenges. But in general, I can think of one student in particular that I wound up working with in a lab course pretty well, who I knew. I didn't really notice after a moment that it just was another student, right, who was working hard and figuring he was a good student. But you just seemed like another student in the class.
Mm-hmm.
I remember asking someone once who did that. He was an older gentleman who had done it, I think back in the 40s. He had gone through very quickly and gone to college and gotten out. And I asked him, well, why did you do that? And he said his parents had pushed him. And I was like, what? And the reason was, the sooner he graduated, the sooner he'd get a job and get out of their house. And it was really just a one less mouth to feed attitude. So I don't know if that's the current. I don't think that's the current driving force among a lot of them. But there could be. I think the point is that every case is different.
Yeah. The one thing I do love about young Sheldon is that he lived in a family that were supportive of him, even though they didn't understand him and his uniqueness and the way that they presented him. But his family still cares so much, and that's why, as Adina says, the ending is so Chuck knew where it was going to end because they established that in the series. He had already established it, but still, even watching the last couple episodes, you didn't want this character to disappear.
Yeah,
George, he was remarkable.
Right. So here's that, some of the spoilers again, people. This has been out for a few months. Pause here, but it's also, if you watch Big Bang Theory, it's not quite a spoiler. We know that his, Sheldon's dad dies. So the second to last episode of Young Sheldon is the funeral, and I'm not a very emotional person. I'm the last person to get choked up at anything on screen. I
don't believe it.
Bawling. I was watching it before Trek Long Island. When we were at Trek, when we were waiting for Trek Long Island to start. That's when I was catching up and watching it. And each morning I was watching 2 or 3 episodes that last season. And that episode, bawling.
Yeah.
That does not happen to me.
Which is short. The final season 7 is only 14 episodes, I think.
Yeah.
It was short rather than the usual 22 because of the writer's strike. It was a writer's strike. But boy, that last season, because so much work. I mean, I love every episode, but that last season really holds together really nicely. It really puts, goes far because of all we've invested. And I was glad to see, when we started this, I wasn't sure if we'd lose George halfway through the series or something.
Okay.
We get to keep him all the way to the end, except maybe the one last episode. It's really great. What a way to go. And then the fact, I guess it's not surprising, it's the second to last episode, so you can end on a more positive note.
Right. But the scene where Sheldon is at the breakfast table and he's dealing with his dad's passing.
Oh, and that's rough.
They show right away the clip from Wrath of Khan. And then he says, "Goodbye, Dad." And they share each other the Vulcan salute as he walks out the door. And Missy says, "What are you thinking about?" He goes, "Star Trek." And she goes, "How could you?" But that was his go-to place for reality and understanding. And I always thought that was so very special, that Trek was so important for the writers, I guess, and to make it part of Sheldon's life growing up.
But they did it in a perfect way where we could see and understand what is happening in Sheldon's head. We completely get it. His sister, his family, they have no idea what's going through his head. Like they cannot comprehend. They don't see it. They don't get the viewpoint that we get to have there. But
aren't these, these writers are really amazing.
They did a great job. Fantastic job. So for you, how,
what was I going to say?
So for you, how was it different working on Young Sheldon versus Big Bang Theory?
So it was a totally different experience for me to work on Young Sheldon than Big Bang, because Big Bang was 80% of it or 90% of it was filmed in front of a live studio audience. And so it's like you got together on Tuesday afternoon through the evening and you put on a play for your friends. And often you had friends in the audience. Speaking of which, I'll tie it back to the one, some members of the audience that would come regularly were writers from the original series Star Trek.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, that's really
Nice.
cool.
And of course, the writers and the cast and the crew loved them back. And that was a wonderful connection there. There's a very genuine love for Star Trek among the show. So that was all, and so I would come every week, and I would come sometimes twice if I had to come to a rehearsal or help with a chalkboard that they might be using or with some equipment on the table. I'll go back to say a word about something I learned about giving advice. Where Young Sheldon is filmed more like a movie. There's only one camera instead of multiple cameras. At Big Bang, there's 4 cameras so that you can catch every angle at once. It's very efficient. The single camera is slower. It gives them, I think, more cinematic control over the lighting and other sort of tonal elements. There's no audience, which I think was an advantage when the cast was really young. But watching that being produced is really like watching paint dry. You hear the same line 50 times. There's no way the writers can be there all the time because they also have to write the future episodes. And so and then COVID hit as well. So I really didn't go to the set much at all. I knew some of the writers, but I was a little more distant from the show, the production of the show. I didn't know all the grips and everything like I did in Big Bang. Still love both shows. But I really just knew the people I worked with, like in sets and props, but not so many from the other departments. And so it was pretty different, and partly it was because of COVID, but just also that style. So if people haven't noticed, if you're watching a comedy, there's the 2 major types of comedy. There is the sort of stagey, multi-camera, often where you hear laughter, and then like Big Bang, and then Young Sheldon, which is less theatrical, a little more dramatic. I don't know, I'm not using the right word, maybe. But there's no audience laughter. There's no sense of that you're part of an audience when you're watching it, and that's called single cam. And they're just different. They just have their different styles.
You must be enjoying this, Cris, because you're interested in cinematography.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated by, because I remember, like, I shouldn't say starting out because I'm like just in film school, so I'm not starting out, like I'm just beginning, but like first learning about it, I always thought that it was odd that bigger shows had single cam, and I thought, well, wouldn't you want to have multicam? And then, but then learning about it, where it's like, okay, right, so you have a multicam show, you can get all the angles at once, but you can't fine tune them as much. So just seeing, I just find it fascinating just to see how different shows can be, and how, like, especially when something like Young Sheldon comes out, and you assume that if there's going to be a spinoff, at least that's what I assumed before we started hearing about Young Sheldon, that, if they ever do a spinoff, it's going to be in the same format. But it's very unique to have a sitcom that spins off into still a sitcom, but not the same style in front of a live audience sitcom. So I found that very interesting.
And I think there are a lot of technical reasons to do it, partly the kids being younger, but I think it was a really wise decision because it distanced the 2 shows. So Young Sheldon was its own show. Most of the cast and crew were new to the show, and so it was their show. And in fact, one thing I've learned, which is kind of fascinating, is there's a lot of people who've come to this universe first through Young Sheldon, younger people. And it's news to them that there's another show where Sheldon's an adult. And they're like, really? And
really?
Watch it in a reverse order, which is going to be a completely different experience.
Yeah, I wonder what that'd be like watching Young Sheldon, because I feel like a lot of, and this is true for, I think, a lot of prequels, where it's always like, I'm a big believer watching things in release order. So if you're going to start with a prequel, like, I guess you could technically, because it's a prequel, but I feel like you'll get a lot more out of the show if you had seen Big Bang Theory. And then you get to see how they deal with, like, even with the George situation, because the way they made George sound in the in Big Bang Theory was like, he's a jerk. He cheated on his wife, all this stuff. But then he's super loving and caring. And so they did that cool thing where, oh, he wasn't cheating on his wife. They were just in costume.
Right.
They were just, doing their own thing. And so I feel like you would get more appreciation of that by
And there's
watching.
something really deep going on, I think.
Yeah.
Also that his memory was imperfect, I think, when he first, and then we realized because it's even an even older Sheldon who's narrating this.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
realized that his original interpretation and perception was not as much, later he has his own kids, and his perception on his own past changes, which is wild, right? That's actually probably partly the reason it was different was just because it was a better show to not follow exactly what Big Bang said.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I mean, that's the writer. You have to ask the writer about that. But I think I like the way they went with George as opposed to
Absolutely. It wouldn't have worked if he was a jerk.
No.
Yeah, because that would have been a very different
really
show.
Important sort of concept on memory and how we remember our childhoods and all of that. And so it in the end, to my mind, it made the whole thing even deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because like he gets called out by Amy, I think, at the very end, where she's like, "Wait, are you misremembering that?" So that was interesting. Now I'm curious because you talked a lot about watching the actors work. What was it like to see? I don't know if you were on set that day, but to be able to see Amy and Sheldon in those characters, but working on a very different set than Big Bang Theory.
Oh, I didn't see them for when they came back to Young Sheldon. Unfortunately, I didn't see them that day or days that they were there. I did come back towards the end. The head producer Tim Mark said, "You've been around for a long time, but remember you want to come back." And I thought he was glad. I was glad I did it. That was right. I was glad he did it. And then I had to pick which day, and it was one of the days was going to be when we hear what happens to George. I was like, or it was the funeral. I was like, I don't think I want to be there that day.
Oh, wow.
I picked some other day where it was a little lighter.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I missed them on their return, whatever days those were. Yeah.
Well, in true Pasadena form, they lived in a craftsman home, which was very nice. Question for you, David, in the Big Bang Theory, the great character of Professor Proton, played by Bob Newhart, and I'm a big Bob Newhart fan. I've loved him since the early 60s. And here's a guy that never won an Emmy until he appeared on that show playing Professor Proton.
I didn't know
question
that.
to you is, was there ever a Professor Proton that you watched that got you into science as well?
Right, because this is before the days of Bill Nye, the Science Guy, when I was younger. And if before I get to your question, I'll tell you a little bit. I often brought a guest with me to the tapings, which were live tapings. It was a bit of cross-cultural pollination. And sometimes it was a student, and sometimes it was a Nobel laureate. It was just a range, and the writers would enjoy talking to them. And the student knew that was the same episode where Bill Nye was there as Professor Proton.
Right, yeah.
And the student knew Bill Nye, but not Bob Newhart. And I was like, okay, you got to go look up Bob Newhart. And then came back later and said, yeah, that guy is really funny. But just shows about the generations. For me, what did I watch back then in terms of nonfiction? I loved this thing. It was on PBS, but it probably came from BBC because he had a British accent. Was this show called Connections? I think his name was James Burke. It was an hour, and he'd just tell you the story. Well, this led to this, and if it hadn't been for that, then this would have happened. And it was just this wonderful. Do any of you remember that? That would have been.
That sounds really familiar. The name sounds familiar.
It was called Connections, and it literally was just he would walk through, why we have light bulbs starting, back in the 16th century or something. If it hadn't been for this, very tightly written. I remember watching this is long before the Oppenheimer movie. There was an Oppenheimer miniseries with Sam Waterston as Oppenheimer.
That's what I always say. that, when we see things that are like quote unquote wrong in movies and film, if it sparks the interest, if it sparks someone to ask the question, like it doesn't bother me. So you are watching any kind of media and you're like, oh my God, they got, this wrong in this movie here, this show there. What is your level of
Right.
botheredness?
Well, there's wrong and there's wrong, So, you could be a real pill and say, well, in Back to the Future, they really couldn't have had a time machine. And even if you went backwards in time, you'd be in a space where the Earth wasn't present and you would die. So so I'm not going to go that far. I mean, you have to let people tell their story. And I always thought that was my role as a science consultant, was just to help the writers and the actors and everyone else find their way through, and not to be the science police, right? If you want to have Ghostbusters, I mean, scientifically accurate, it wouldn't be Ghostbusters.
Right.
Creative decision. So those kinds of things don't bother me at all. What does jar me is something like, the other spaceship is so many hectares off our bow, which of course doesn't make.
Just watching the episodes of the reruns of Big Bang Theory that were on TV happened to be one where they were discussing the whole time travel thing in between.
Is this the
Big Bang,
has not thing?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I was watching that clip too, and I was like, I love it. So perfect.
Yes.
I like the one where they find the time machine from the original 1960s movie. And
different, yeah.
Yeah, and just how they, like, what if it really worked? They were so excited about finding this movie prop.
Let's come back to this moment and visit ourselves if we ever. And then nothing happens, and they go, well, that was disappointing.
So I've got a question about some of the characters, because you talked a little bit about the end game. Do you know if there's any discussion about, like, say, all right, we know we're going to have Sheldon and Amy win the Nobel Prize, but was there any talk about, like, maybe having Leonard or Raj having, or even Howard, like, having some big breakthrough that would, like, elevate them?
Well, I don't remember too much. Don't want to, even if I knew, I kind of wouldn't want to expose these kind of alternate universes and kind of like ruin it in people's heads, because there is sort of a story.
That's fair.
I don't think they would give the same story to two characters, because that wouldn't be as interesting. I don't know, but I'm not a writer. So everybody kind of did follow had their story kind of resolved in some way,
right?
Differently, but yeah. And of course, first of all, I'm not even there in the writer's room to know all the cases, but I think also people shouldn't want to know, because I think it'll just kind of spoil your review of what choices were made.
But even so, in the last episode of Big Bang, when Sheldon is doing a speech, he takes time to thank his friends. And I think that was very significant in that, even though he's an egotistical, narcissistic, self-centered individual, he still had in his heart, he had to thank his friends, and it was a fitting way to end the series.
And it was actually showing a moment of growth, again, final growth. What was interesting was, coming back, I remember the opposite in young Sheldon when he says goodbye to Tam, and he just does it really bad, his friend Tam.
Yes.
And comes back and he says goodbye. And it's really kind of unsatisfying in some ways, because Sheldon was just kind of being a bad friend, And I remember discussing it with some people, and I was like, yeah, this is so sad and unsatisfying in a way. And they're like, yeah, but he has this moments in Big Bang where he grows. For example, the scene you're talking about, twice. So in that sense, in young Sheldon, they're constrained. They can't have him grow too much. He does grow.
Right. Because he hasn't grown yet. And this is why it's important to watch things in the order in which they've appeared on television, not not in universe timeline necessarily.
So Dina, shall we go for the final spoiler about young Sheldon, to the final person who gets to talk to Sheldon at the very end?
Well, we're talking to him right now.
We are. And that was
So, for our listeners, if you actually want to see Professor Saltzberg here, watch that final episode, and he's in it. So, how did that?
So yes, yeah, not just the final episode; it's the final scene.
Yes,
Yes, it is.
That's
So
huge.
can we say what happens? I mean,
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
do it.
We've told people
we
spoilery.
spoiler all the
Spoiler,
time.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so Sheldon arrives at Caltech right after having visited MIT, and it was too cold.
Yes,
And,
that was
so
funny.
of course,
That was great.
It's a new beginning for him, and he's looking at a sign that says California Institute of Technology. It's a very short scene, and someone walks up to him. Somebody who looks like he's dressed like a professor. It's me, wearing some very 1994 brown and tan clothing, and some glasses from back then, and just says, "You lost?" And he says, "No, I'm exactly where I need to be." And I kind of get a little nod, and he walks off into the beautiful sky, not sunset, but walks onto the beautiful California sky towards some of the famous buildings at Caltech. And that's it. That's the end. So it was a huge honor to be asked in that scene. I mean, my gosh, that's the very last scene of 7 seasons of Young Sheldon plus 12 seasons of Big Bang. It's a huge number of years. And to be asked to be in that final scene was amazing and scary. They asked, it was Steve Holland who called me and asked if I wanted to do it. And I had to say yes, but I was, of course, a bit frightened. It was great. So I went a few days early and got fitted for clothing. And I felt a little bit like my father, given the clothing. And I remembered those very geometrical and wide ties and all of that. And the other thing is you go, well, how hard could this be, right? You go, well, I'm just going to walk up and say my 2 lines. I'll act natural. In my mind, I'm a professor, and then I'll walk off. But what you don't see is that there's all these cameras that are like zoomed into one little spot that you have to, and you're walking and you have to hit that spot. They call it a mark. And there's a piece of tape on the floor, but you can't be looking down at the floor because in real life, this professor would not be looking for a piece of tape. You can't even look like you walked up and planted yourself at the right spot. If you miss by 6 inches, they have to retake it, and it has to all look natural. And this is what these actors do every day, and it's actually not so easy. Managed to do it with a bit of practice in advance. I was a little nervous, but I was happy with the way it came out. And the other thing is I knew my job was to be small because this was about Sheldon, about young Sheldon and the end of his story. And I was there to facilitate, to say something to facilitate that story. That said, after the scene, I went to the writers and I said, I have an idea for a spinoff. Who is this professor? Where is he going?
You got the acting bug. Okay.
Did they laugh just like we did just now, or did they?
I remember. I think they're a little tired of people pitching stories at them.
I bet. Yeah.
Probably the equivalent of when you're a physicist, someone comes up to you and says, "I have a model of gravity."
Well, so speaking of other physicists, one of the things that I was very impressed by, and again, I don't know how folks who, I guess, aren't deep into physics, how they took this, but in that last season or two, there's like Kip Thorne and George Smoot. Like, whose idea was that? Because these are not people, these are, again, if you are studying physics, chances are you know who these people are. If you're not studying physics, there's a good chance you don't. Kip Thorne's written some books for, anyone. And actually, George Smoot did too. He wrote one on Kobe. But so how did that happen?
Arnold.
Where did that start?
Arnold was another Nobel laureate. She was there, and some others. This idea of also whose idea something is, I also, if I even knew, I don't like to get into because I think it's a very collaborative exercise to do this kind of putting stories together and writing and so forth. And people are going to pitch ideas and so forth. And sometimes they're going to be really good and sometimes they're not good. And I kind of feel like you should sort of forget who came up with what idea because it'll compromise your future. Like, oh, well, 5 years from now, we're going to say this was so-and-so's idea. And I think if you're collaborating, you should just let that go, and just your group thought of it. That said, I take no credit for this because I think I just read about it. In this case, I'm happy to tell you I just read about it in the script. But I just don't think it's productive to try to remember who came up with what
Okay, no, that's fair. I guess I'm impressed. So they had a lot of guest stars, but they had a lot of actor guest stars that I think would be generally known for that audience. But then having the science guest stars, like I said, I'm just saying I'm impressed that was included, and it made my day. To see
a lot of the
Kip
guest
Thorne.
stars were kind of, I think, just the writers wanted to meet so and so they found a way to write them in.
Sure, why not?
But it gives credibility to it. It gives some reality to it. You having real scientists or real physicists on the show.
I mean, all of the comic book stuff and the sci-fi and everything. There was a genuine love. It's a love to some extent. It's a love story to all of that kind of fandom from the writers themselves. When people say that somehow this is like anti-nerd humor, it's like
no.
I've heard people say that, and it's like no. I mean, for me, being a nerd and being a Trekkie, like I remember, like I watched it I think I watched it from the beginning. I remember liking it and enjoying it, and then when I think Sheldon mentions the star date for the episode, the Enterprise incident, when they steal the cloaking device, and the fact that they got the star date right, I looked it up and I'm like, that's brilliant. Like that's just like to have someone on TV say that was like the coolest thing, and it just made it feel like, okay, this is legit. Even if the actors themselves aren't nerds, the writers clearly are, and it's
if I remember it correctly,
fun to see.
Had some framed comic books in his bedroom, if I remember it correctly, and there were some special issues, and they belonged to one of the writers.
Okay.
Nice. Yeah, as part of, I think, the core demographic of that show, I mean, like, I never felt made fun of. That's why, like, when people say they're making fun of nerd, no. Again, those people I know, myself, and who, again, in physics and in STEM, and even as a woman, I don't feel like at any point in time I was being made fun of or used in a negative way. So I think they did a great job.
It's interesting to see how people react to it, but I think people maybe are not missing the point, but I always just felt like it was a very like respectful show, and if you were a nerd, you would appreciate it for that. But if you weren't, you would appreciate Penny and being like, okay, how is she interacting with the boys? And then sort of understanding where they're coming from now.
That a super fan would get. I think I've read about some things on Reddit or something. There is no way you're going to satisfy this in this kind of world. You are going to say something wrong,
Oh yeah, for sure.
Say one or two science things wrong that I felt bad about. Maybe I won't even say what they are, but I think I can think of two things we got wrong, and I just felt bad about, because it's going to happen. You're doing 239 episodes, talking that much, and don't forget these episodes come together in 6 days, and so. Mistakes are going to happen. But we kept them to a minimum.
Are there any scientific concepts you wished had gotten in that never got in?
That's really interesting because, sometimes they would ask. So what happened was they would ask me sometimes it was just science to come in the script, and it was just some words needed. And so telling you, go think of some science is a little bit like telling a comedian, go be funny, right? You need a little bit of something to bounce off of. So sometimes it would be the setup would spark something in my mind because it's so constrained. Like, hey, they go to the roof and they're doing something scientific at night when Penny and her boyfriend comes up, and that immediately lent itself to something I'd heard of, which was bouncing lasers off the moon to tests of general relativity and things like that. And so they'd given such a constrained idea that like the one possibility popped into my mind, and maybe a second one, but it was so constrained, I found that easier than when they just have an open science to come. So what I would do is sometimes some science would interest me, and I would say, oh, that might be useful sometime. And so I had a little Word document that I would just write things into. And then if I was just really stuck, I would go back to that document and just kind of see if any of those things would spark. And here, and one thing I really wanted to do, and I'm sorry we didn't do it, was I had, they wanted something for Raj that would be like a pretty big discovery in astronomy. I think it was for Raj. What would it be? And one of the ideas I pitched, or it was something they got involved in something, I can't remember, which didn't, just wound up on the cutting room floor. They went to something was like, oh, let's say they find an asteroid, but it's from, or a meteorite on the ground, or an asteroid in space. And for some reason, they determined it didn't come from our own solar system. Like, that would be kind of cool. Maybe there'd be signs of life on it. I don't know. And at the time, I wasn't even sure how you would know, right? And about a year or two after that, there was a discovery of this object, which is called Oumuamua, which has a certain, and it turns out because it has what's called a hyperbolic trajectory, we knew it. That turns out to be a signature for something that came from beyond our solar system. And so we missed the chance to predict that discovery. So that's the one that sort of got away. And so I have a list of things. So if we come back for seasons 13, 14, 15, I've got some list of things that were on my mind. But
Big Bang Theory too.
But that was
So and in the whole, it is a
generation.
small. Yeah, it is a small like physics industry. You were just mentioning bouncing lasers off the moon. So the professors that designed the retroreflectors that were left on the moon were they were my professors when I was at school at Maryland.
Oh my goodness.
Dr. Curry and Dr. Alley. I want to say it's Dr. Alley.
They must have started out in the late 50s, early 60s to get it into the program.
Well, so
most people didn't know that we had left retroreflectors. Those are mirrors that are set up in just the right way so that it always reflects light back at you from the direction it came. If you ever throw a ball into the corner of a room, it comes right back at you, and it can bounce any number of ways among the walls, but it comes straight back at you. And the same thing is true for mirrors three mirrors at 90-degree angles. And that's like in bicycle. I think bicycle reflectors use that principle as well.
Yeah. So
those left on the moon, and a lot
and
of
the way
people didn't know.
Yeah, the way I found out, because I was in my final year of school, and my space club, we had brought Buzz Aldrin to come speak at school. And Dr. Alley, he was, I think, emeritus at the time, professor emeritus at the time, he just came up to Buzz Aldrin and shook his hand. He's like, "Hey, it's good to see you. It's been a while." And that's when he told us the story. Like that, I had no idea. that my school was part of that history. And of course that happened before I was born, but just that these professors were involved in that was pretty amazing.
That was before you saw the episode.
This was this would have been like in 1996 or 1996, 97. That was my final year of college.
I just have a new definition of cool too when you just walk up to Buzz Aldrin and shake his hand.
Well, I've shook his hand twice. I've met him 3 times. I've seen him 3 times, but twice I was able to shake his hand, about 20 years apart.
So a funny follow-up to that is you may remember Zach says something like, "Well, you're shooting lasers at the moon, don't blow it up."
Right. Yes.
And so I then happened to meet up again with Professor Tom Murphy, which is at San Diego, which is the reason, and he's using them now, and he's the one who gave me that idea. He said, "Oh yeah, people say that to me all the time." I couldn't believe it. So I went back to the writers and said, "Guess what? That thing that Zach said, people say all the time." And the writer said, "Oh yeah, we can write stupid. It's just smart that we need help with."
That's got to be a t-shirt. I love it.
That's good. That's good.
So it's so funny how like all that develops just from and that was a cool thing about like I could have an idea in my head and then it becomes real. Like in young Sheldon, they're like, what's an experiment he's going to work on with Sturgis and Linkletter, right? And in that case, I'll confess, I was trying to think of something that would look visually interesting for them to work on, right? If they're just soldering something or doing a calculation, it wouldn't be as interesting. So at that time, so that was helpful to have a constraint, what was happening in the early 90s. People were building these giant spheres of liquid, either water or mineral oil to detect neutrinos. And so I said, well, maybe they're building a prototype. And then the prop master kind comes up with like this beautiful, huge liquid, beautiful, huge spherical glass container and fills it with liquid. It looks amazing the way it refracts the light and everything. And then for some reason, and it might have been Emmy season or some reason, the show was in the news that week. And so the pictures are the actor holding this beautiful, giant, spherical, refractive object. And it's just kind of interesting to think like, wow, I could have easily suggested 10 different things. And somehow you've had, you say one thing and this whole apparatus of writers and prop masters and other people turn it into a reality.
That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So do you think there's other collaborations in your future with the television industry, or you back solely in physics?
I can't imagine. I mean, television's been around for about 100 years. This was about a once in 100-year kind of chance. So it's going to have to be another 100, So first of all, the chance that someone brings physics back in to a show, right? And then it happens to be, this was kind of broad in physics, so I could do it, or some of it, if it, with the stuff I did with Oppenheimer was close to my field, so I knew that. So it could be physics that I don't even know. Like, let's suppose somebody says, hey, we have a physics story and it's about quantum computing. Well, I'm not going to be able to be the person that helps them with that. So even if we had another physics drama or comedy show come along, which seems to be a once in 100 years, the chance that the specific subfield or whatever that it relates to is something I could help with. And, I want to give them help beyond what people can look up in Wikipedia, right?
Right.
Yes.
So it would have to be someone else. So I would have to suggest someone else. So I think that's it. It was wonderful 18 years experience. There was some overlap between the 7 and the 12 seasons. But yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with how that went. But it's I believe a chapter that's ended. Sometimes people ask me in some of your audience, maybe, how do I get involved in this?
I was actually about to ask that. That's perfect.
And my experience is, well, you just you can't plan for it. That said, if someone does have an expertise subsequent to my being involved, there's an organization called the National Academy of Sciences, which has been around since Abraham Lincoln. It's an advisory arm to the government. They formed a group called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So you can just Google National Academy of Sciences, Science Entertainment Exchange. And they have a giant Rolodex of scientists and experts. So, if your expertise is, underwater volcanoes, and somebody happens in 10 years to be making a movie that involves underwater volcanoes, they will look in their Rolodex or maybe it's a certain kind of spider that lives in an underground volcano. However, and you're the expert, get your name into their Rolodex. And then when it comes up, maybe they'll give you a call. That's the closest I could say for how to get involved. But other than that, like I said in the beginning, this just kind of fell in my lap. It's been a wonderful experience.
But you must feel very proud to have been part of both of those two series.
I'm proud of the work that I can't begin. I don't want to be sounded. You talk about how you love the show and everything, and I can't even begin to take even a small part of that. But my little contribution, I'm proud of what I did, and I'm very proud to be part of this group that did something I think was really great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Anyone have any final questions?
So that was my big question. I guess this is a very not science related, but it is something that I do because when I watch TV, I like to eat food. This is my thing. Everybody knows this. Do you have a food that you like to eat when you watch TV, or a routine where you're like, you know what, it's Friday night, I'm going to kick back, I'm going to put on my show and just hang out?
And not spaghetti with hot dogs, okay?
It can be spaghetti with hot dogs.
Oh, do I have any sort of special food that Man, you're killing me because I'm trying not to put on weight. And I think even just thinking about this.
You've stumped the physicist, Cris.
I'm also trying not to put on weight, but I'm
there's a question really you can't answer.
Anything special, obviously the usual things. I'm trying to think if there's something. My research, I can tell you, it's not. One thing that I ate once interested the writers. And I'll tell you, it
Okay.
almost made it.
I gotta hear
it
this.
Almost made it. It almost made it into one of the shows. A lot of my research takes place in cold environments like Antarctica or Greenland. And one of the things you can do before you go to sleep to stay warm is, of course, to have hot chocolate because it's warm and there's sugar, but that burns off quite quickly. So what people often do is put half a stick of butter into the hot chocolate. So hot chocolate with butter in it is really good. And if you ever want to, so I'll go with hot chocolate with butter in it.
Okay, now I've got to try
half a stick
that.
of butter.
Not half a stick.
No,
Maybe just a pat, just a pat, maybe just one ounce, just to give it to see if it creamy makes it more creamy.
Take longer to burn, and so you stay warmer. Longer.
Right. Interesting.
Awesome.
That's cool. I did not expect. This is not what I expected, but I love it.
Well, that's cool. I think that's a perfect way to segue into saying, David, thank you so much for joining us for this episode
thank you
today.
For being so interested. My pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Yeah, it's been really cool.
Yeah, this has been very interesting, and I want to talk to you more about just physics, but possibly in a way that would bore everyone else. So we can do that offline another time. So to our listeners, I want to thank you because this, again, is going to bring us to another end of an exciting episode of the Big Sci-Fi Podcast. We hope everyone else has enjoyed diving into this fascinating world and understanding some behind the scenes from The Big Bang Theory and young Sheldon. And don't forget to share this episode with your fellow science and sci-fi enthusiasts and join us in our Facebook group to keep the conversation going. We love to hear what you think about this episode, which physics concepts are your favorite, and what just sparks your curiosity and love for these shows. Thank you for tuning in. Remember to subscribe for more episodes where we will unravel the mysteries of the universe one sci-fi show at a time. Until next time, keep your curiosity charged and your mind open to the wonders of science. Live long and prosper, everyone, and join us next time here at the Big Sci-Fi Podcast.
Coconut.